The Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, was slated to give this lecture. As you know, he's also chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, but competing schedules made him unable to be here. So here I am, shaking in my smaller shoes, but ready to step into the conversation that we have been having all day. Now, those of you who have read Capitalism and Slavery from cover to cover, and I have a feeling that that applies to everyone in this audience, you might be saying to yourselves, Eric Williams never expressed explicitly a view about reparation or reparatory justice in his path-breaking work, so how does Capitalism and Slavery become a handbook for the reparation movement? You may even say that the strongest R word he used was resistance, as he laid out in chapter 12, The Saints and Slavery, the role of the enslaved in the anti-slavery struggle as the sinews of empire fought back. But while Eric Williams may not have written Capitalism and Slavery to directly support the reparatory justice cause as it is currently formulated or articulated, it has become an indispensable handbook for all those seeking the evidentiary basis for the reparation claim against Britain in particular. There are those who say that Williams had another focus, not restitution for colonial wrongs in the way we articulate it in the reparation movement. Adam Getatru, in her February 2017 article titled Reparation and the Recasting of Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, suggests that Williams was pursuing a different path in the modern period of decolonization. Getatru states that, and I quote, writing at the dawn of decolonization, when the promise of the post-colonial state's capacity to transform the legacies of colonialism was as yet untested, Williams placed his hopes in anti-colonial nationalism and post-colonial institutions, not reparation, as it is now articulated as engines of transformation. His vision, she says, was couched in the language of independence and autonomy, and his political imagination was structured by a commitment to and faith in the capacity of the state. So for her, the answer to the problem of dependence for Williams was not a demand for reparation, but the creation of a West Indian Federation. Getatru does remind us that in his concluding remarks at the 1943 conference, co-organized at Howard University with Rayford Logan and Franklin Frazier, Williams reiterated what he wrote in Capitalism and Slavery, that Caribbean economic predicament was attributable to the development of Europe at the expense of Caribbean. But she says he argued that federation would make possible an economic development that was otherwise impossible and give the Caribbean area bargaining power in the world, which its isolated units did not then have. A unified political and economic structure, Williams and other Caribbean federalists hoped, would redirect Caribbean economies towards producing the goods needed domestically and create a program for development and industrialization. Federalists believed that over time, the Federation would transform dependence into self-sufficiency. Added to this, as Professor Stephen Vassiani wrote in his 2016 piece in the Jamaica Observer, it was occasionally posited that closer union would strengthen labor unity in the region and create stronger bargaining power for the Caribbean entities as a whole in international negotiations. He recalled a 1956 address at Woodford Square in which Eric Williams put the matter of small size in its context, quoting, "The units of government are getting larger and larger. Federation is inescapable if the British Caribbean territories are to cease to parade themselves to the 20th century world as 18th century anachronisms," end of quote. As Sir Sridath Ramphal also noted, quote, "In an interdependent world which in the name of liberalization made no distinction between rich and poor, big and small, regional unity was compulsive," end of quote. As we now know, the federal project did not work out the way Williams envisioned. That is a preferred model for a self-sufficient and independent and united Caribbean. It was not a happy outcome for Britain, which had its own expectation of federation. Despite its debt to the region, Britain was anxious, as Gordon K. Lewis claims in The Growth of the Modern West Indies, to use federation as a means of discarding its then unwanted responsibilities as a colonial power. But this is something that Williams had always recognized, as Erica, his daughter, reminded us this morning. He was clear about Britain's debt to the region and refused what he termed aid, which he regarded as unacceptable. In fact, it was he who said, and you can see this in your program, this quotation, "The British Empire was a magnificent superstructure of American commerce and a naval power on an African foundation," a clear recognition of what Britain owes to African people. However, by the 1960s, others had started to posit the view that formal independence and nationalism had failed to fulfill the promise or the promises of development, democracy, and autonomy, and that reparation was a better option. In other words, unlike what people called aid, reparation was the answer. So the reparation demand rests on the political claim that slavery and the trade in enslaved Africans were crimes against humanity, that these crimes are deeply connected to contemporary global inequalities, and that the root of these crimes are traceable to the fact that slavery and the Ma'afa enriched Europe and impoverished the Caribbean. Gordon Lewis hinted at this when he wrote in The Growth of the Modern West Indies that, and I quote, "Britain sought withdrawal from the Caribbean area without providing the sort of economic aid to which, on any showing, the colonies were entitled," end of quote. Sir Ellis Clark, who was the Trinidadian government's United Nations representative to a subcommittee of the Committee on Colonialism in 1964, had been more forthright and unambiguous in his justification for reparation. He had realized that nationalism and independence would not by themselves fulfill the aspirations of Caribbean people for progress and development. His view was that an administering power is not entitled to extract for centuries all that can be got out of a colony, and when that has been done, to relieve itself of its obligations by the conferment of a formal but meaningless because it cannot possibly be supported, political independence. Justice requires that reparation be made to the country that has suffered the ravages of colonialism before that country is expected to face up to the problems and the difficulties that will inevitably beset it upon independence. Anything less than that, Sir Ellis Clark concluded, would constitute something less than the genuine article. It would be trying to fob off West Indians with independence on the cheap, a view later shared by Gordon K. Lewis. Ellis went on to suggest that Britain was not facing up to its moral and financial obligations. Bruce Seeley agrees that the new nation should have pressed for compensation at independence, maintaining that the new nations founded with much hope faced daunting economic challenges. Quoting A. Ahmad and A. S. Wilkie in their joint 1979 article, Technology Transfer in the New International Economic Order, Options, Obstacles, and Dilemmas, he repeated their idea that these nations soon began to realize that political freedom could not be construed as an end in itself, and that achieving it did not automatically ensure the social and economic well-being of their people. But it took several decades after Clark, Lewis, and Seeley for heads of government of CARICOM, a sort of region which, as we know, Williams helped to bring about, to conceive or to realize that, as Geta Shaw put it, we live in an age that can no longer conceive of its aspirations for post-colonial futures in the terms and idioms that animated Williams and other Federalists. Of course, individual politicians had been in the movement before 2013, but it was in 2013 that CARICOM, as a collective, formally placed its hat in the reparation ring and publicly spoke in collective terms about reparation. CARICOM might might not be the grand unifying pan-Caribbean project of federation as conceived by Williams, but it has stepped in to share in the activism of Rastafari, civil society, and academics, and to take up the mantle of finding a solution to the underdevelopment which is a legacy of British colonialism. A discarded and marginalized Caribbean in the British economic and political project has now returned to make the case for reparation, using Williams' 1944 argument in Capitalism and Slavery, as well as his vision of, I suppose, British responsibility. Britain's rise to a position of global power had been dependent on the Caribbean and Africa, but as decolonization had not been met with adequate financial support, the time had come to confront Britain and other complicit nations about their obligation. Williams will be pleased that they are sticking to it, or maybe sticking it to Britain. Now, so it was, just as context and a reminder, it was at their 34th regular meeting of the Conference of Heads of Government of CARICOM, held right here in Trinidad and Tobago in 2013, that heads took a decision to align themselves formally with the reparation movement and to press European governments for reparation. They agreed to set up national committees on reparation in each CARICOM state where none existed. At that time, only Jamaica had one, and to establish the moral, ethical, and legal case for the payment of reparation by the former colonial countries, European countries, to the nations and people of the Caribbean community for native genocide, the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans, a racialized system of chattel enslavement, and an unjust colonial and neo-colonial system which continued to harm the region. And to date, these are the countries against which claims are being prepared. By 2014, national committees had been established in Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Belize, Guyana, Jamaica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, Dominica, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Bahamas, with members drawn from a wide cross-section of Caribbean society, Rastafari, academics, legal practitioners, grassroots. And I have no idea why it's blinking, but anyway. There were grassroots organizations, church leaders, artists, and they established links with reparation activists and networks in the non-independent Caribbean countries of Guadeloupe, Martinique, the British and US Virgin Islands, and the Dutch colonized Caribbean. Links were also established with reparation committees and organizations in Africa, Asia, Canada, the EU, Latin America, the UK, and the USA. For what CARICOM has joined is a global African reparation movement. Unfortunately, as we speak, only about 3 or 4 national committees currently exist because CARICOM heads have reneged on their responsibility. Don't think there's one here either, right now. Heads mandated the establishment of a CARICOM Reparations Commission led by a core committee that is a chair and 3 vice chairs and comprising the chairs of the national committees and a representative of the UWI. And the core committee and the chairs of national committees report directly to a prime ministerial subcommittee on reparations comprising the heads of government of Barbados, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Haiti, Guyana, and Suriname, who would provide political oversight. Heads of government also requested that the UWI establish a Center for Reparation Research to support the CRC. By joining the movement, CARICOM was signaling that decades after independence, the people of the Caribbean are still struggling to achieve economic independence and sustainable development, end poverty, and make the region less vulnerable to the ravages of natural and man-made disasters and the impact of climate change and centuries-old environmental degradation. While a multiplicity of strategies has been pursued by the post-colonial political regimes in their efforts to overcome socioeconomic, environmental, and political challenges, as Western European powers left the region and underdeveloped after having used our resources with indigenous and forcefully imported labor to ensure their own development, reparation as part of decolonial justice for such underdevelopment has been placed firmly and squarely on the table. The argument is that the work of remaking the Caribbean is not possible without restitution. The next task mandated by the heads of government was the drafting of a generic letter to be sent to 6 European countries that had colonized the region and enslaved its African ancestors, the UK, Portugal, Spain, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark, setting out the main reasons for the reparation demand. Now, capitalism and slavery had long showed that the trade and slavery engulfed a diversity of nations, with the first to start passing the baton to the other. To help to build the case for reparation, Capitalism and Slavery became an indispensable handbook. The claim had to show Britain's role in almost wiping out the indigenous people, specifically in the Eastern Caribbean, in conceptualizing and financing the enterprise that became chattel slavery, its culpability in the trafficking of Africans, its links to slave trading companies like the Royal African Company, the rise of its cities and ports because of slave trading, the enrichment of its citizens from all walks of life because of the exploitation of unpaid African laborers, and the profits generated from colonial outputs. Its use of slave-generated wealth to establish industries and financial institutions, its militarization of the Caribbean to suppress African protests and ward off competitors, its cruelty and barbarism towards Africans, its resistance to emancipation, and when it capitulated, its payment of compensation to the enslavers while leaving the formerly enslaved with nothing but freedom in Eric Foner's formulation, and its continuation of the mentalities and ideologies of slavery into the post-slavery period have all been raised and put on the table. The impact of these are proving hard to dislodge. African people are still walking in a circle, so vividly represented in 2015 Man Booker Prize Marlon James's historical novel, The Book of Night Women. And I quote from his book, "Every Negro walks in a circle. Take that and make of it what you will. A circle like a sun, a circle like a moon, a circle like bad tidings that seems gone but always comes back," end of quote. Capitalism and slavery has served reparation activists well. It is, after all, a study of the contribution of slavery to the development of British capitalism. Williams makes it clear that the Caribbean was central to capital accumulation in Europe, and that slavery was critical to the making of British or European modernity. The transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and plantation slavery and associated enterprise made industrialization in England possible, as they did the emergence and profitability of financial institutions. Capital generated from the Caribbean facilitated the development of banks. Slavery profits swelled the coffers of towns and cities like London, Bristol, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, Edinburgh, enriched families and individuals, and established schools, universities, and churches. Whether or not racism was born of slavery or the other way around, the book is clear that racism came to undergird the slave system in the Caribbean. The means by which black bodies were mobilized to create profits added to the crime against humanity. We know that Spain, Netherlands, USA, and Britain traded Africans to this Twin Island Republic. Between 1606 and 1833, 101 voyages were undertaken by these traders to Trinidad, with 25,285 of the 28,249 who embarked on slavers disembarking, with an overall mortality of 11%. Abolition of the trade in 1807, effective 1808, should have saved Africans from this horror, but we know, based on the ELTIS database 2.0, that show ships captured and taken to Sierra Leone and elsewhere, that up to the late 19th century, attempts were made to sell Africans to the region. Many of them were disembarked closer to West Africa and therefore offloaded in Sierra Leone, but some actually were taken to the Caribbean. And here you can see, and you can actually manipulate the database for yourself to show the ages of the children that were taken and left in Sierra Leone. And for me, most importantly, their names. How much more could we have known had they taken the time to capture the names before the end? And some of you will think of your parents and your grandparents when you look at this list. What were they doing scraping up 77-year-olds to put them into slavery? But that is the evidence. The labor of Africans created profits for Britain, which fueled the Industrial Revolution and developed the UK's economy and society. Postlethwaite described the transatlantic trafficking as the first principle and foundation of all the rest, the mainspring of the machine which sets every wheel in motion. And Britain earned £5 million per year from sugar during the peak of the industry. And over a century, Britain alone made 500 million, equal to over 2.5 trillion pounds today. Royal families throughout Europe developed financial interest in the trade, and slavery was profitable for the British economy. One should recall that the English gave royal patronage to the transatlantic trafficking and slavery through the establishment of the Company of Royal Adventurers Trading to Africa, which after 5 years of operation was recapitalized and incorporated into the Royal African Company in 1663. The RAC was chaired by the Duke of York, nephew to the then king, and members of the royal family were prominent investors in it. This is reason for involving the present monarchy in the reparation claim, as the royal family inherited wealth from that period. In March 2007, British MP Diane Abbott reminded her parliamentary colleagues that 15 Lord Mayors, 25 sheriffs, and 38 aldermen were shareholders in the Royal African Company. It is estimated that in 1776, 40 members of the British Parliament were making their money from investments in the Caribbean. It was only economic forces combined with convenient humanitarianism and political actions in the metropole and boots of black soldiers on the ground in the Caribbean that forced its demise. Up to 1783, Williams argued all classes in English society presented a unified front with regard to the enterprise, despite knowledge of the evils manifested. But money was there to be made for opposition to triumph before 1783, he says. Indeed, Williams was clear that the enslaved furthered the cause of emancipation, that they were the objects and basis of the movement for emancipation. Williams's thesis held that capitalism as an economic modality quickly replaced slavery once European elites accumulated the vast surplus capital from slavery that they needed in order to bankroll the Industrial Revolution. As a result of the evidence that Williams amassed against Britain, J.A. Rogers, in his review of Capitalism and Slavery, according to Colin Palmer, complimented Williams for showing better than I can recall ever having seen what the New World owes to the Negro, the victims of slavery and the slave trade, for its development, particularly in its pioneer stage, as well as England, for its rise from a small power to the world's greatest empire, which is why justice on behalf of our African ancestors features so prominently in reparation activism. And while we search for their names and we find their names, we also search for their photographs, and we try to popularize what they did in the cause of Caribbean freedom. So we have Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica, Cecile Fatiman of Haiti, Loke, they called her One Titi Loke, because having run away as a Maroon, they cut off her breast as punishment. Alida, Sally Bassett, burnt at the stake, solitude. So using the evidence from Capitalism and Slavery as the foundational text and adding other books on similar themes published since, along with archival records to which Williams may or may not have had access, or perhaps had access but never thought of using, the governments of CARICOM through the CRC have articulated the justification for the reparation demand. The CRC stresses that the region's indigenous and African descendant communities who are the victims of crimes against humanity in the forms of genocide, enslavement, human trafficking, deceptive Asian indentureship, and racial apartheid have a legal right to reparatory justice, and that those who committed these crimes and who have been enriched by the proceeds of these crimes have a reparatory case to answer. The plan recognizes the special role and status of European governments in this regard, being the legal bodies that instituted the framework for developing and sustaining these crimes and served as the primary agencies through which slavery-based enrichment took place, and as national custodians of criminally accumulated wealth. And we can summarize the justifications as follows. I'll just sample some of them. The injustice is well documented. Plantation slavery provided the scaffold for Britain's industrial advancement, and so on, because you all know that these arguments can come right from capitalism and slavery. And there is precedent, of course, in the payment of reparation. Not only precedent, for example, Haiti and planter compensation, but I'm always struck by this quotation from Randall Robinson in his book, The Debt, because to me it's like an early example of the strategy and the demand that way. So this is Jordan of Big Spring, Tennessee, writing to his enslaver, or his former enslaver, who asked him after the end of slavery to come back to work for him. And this is what Jordan says, you can see, "Sir, if you will write and say what wages you will give me, I will be better able to decide whether it will be to my advantage to move back again. And we have concluded to test your sincerity by asking you to send us our wages for the time we served you. I have served you faithfully for 32 years, and my wife Mandy 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy, gender discrimination, our earnings would amount to $11,680. And add to this the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing, and 3 doctor's visits for me, and pulling a tooth for Mandy, and the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to. Please send the money by Adams Express." That's a model. The reparation claim is also supported by the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, which talks about the relationship between historical injustices, poverty, underdevelopment, and marginalization. And the right to reparation is recognized by international law, which allows for the claiming of reparation by the descendants of victims. Lord Anthony Gifford, a staunch reparationist, has gone further to set out what he believes are the legal arguments or the legal points should we go that route. The right to reparation is recognized by international law. Enslavement was and is a crime against humanity. So was the transatlantic trafficking in Africans. There is no legal barrier to prevent those who still suffer the consequences of enslavement from claiming reparation, even though the crimes were committed against their ancestors. And international law provides the means for descendants to receive recompense on behalf of their ancestors. Now, I know that he has come up against some discussion and opposition, but he sticks by what he calls his legal argument. And then we know, of course, that one justification also is that compensation was paid to the planters by the British in 1834, and that this is not the total payout, but this is a sample of how the 20 million was shared. And you may have heard Professor Sir Hilary Beckles talk about the scam called apprenticeship, which we're down to another 27 million for planters, because apparently it was part of the plan for them to insist that 20 million was not enough, but if the British government would allow the apprentices, so-called, to work for another 4 to 6 years, then they could recoup what they think the value was. And so here we have part of the sharing out. Now, Trinidad received just over £1 million for 22,359 enslaved Africans, and Tobago 234,064 for 11,621 enslaved Africans. And of course, we know that there have been several beneficiaries, including, I won't go through them, but I don't remember who some of them are anyway. But we certainly know this one, and the novelist. Okay, so Williams did not do a full analysis, obviously, of the compensation claims, as the University College London has now done, although he did name some individual beneficiaries in his book, and so we got a direction. So now we have the full UCL research, and we can actually look at the top 10 payouts to men in Trinidad. And you'll see that the highest payout of £48.3 million went to, in today's money that is, went to the top man, William Harding Burnley. I don't know if you have done any research on this particular person. You could share, please. There's a book? Good. So yeah, okay, good. I'll make sure the center gets that book. So he topped the top 10 male beneficiaries list for Trinidad, and the total for the 10 was £192.4 million. Now the top women, these are the names we've been able to get from the documents. So they received together £41.09 million, with Anne Penelope getting the highest payout of $10.8 million in 2018 equivalent. The negotiating strategy to seek justice for now is the 10-point action plan. And before setting up the plan, I admit that the Durban Declaration and the Program of Action and the Program of Action for the International Decade for People of African Descent, which I had the pleasure of drafting while I was chair of the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent at the United Nations, do offer some solutions for how states can address the crisis of underdevelopment in post-colonial societies. But those solutions are rather vague and non-binding, as some of the UN things tend to be, and are framed within the context of what David Martin terms lexical colonialism, with insufficient emphasis placed on the recipient and not enough empowerment of the recipient to deal with the artifact being transferred. So the 10-point action plan, I'm sure you have seen this already. Some may wish, to add, some may wish to take off, but it starts with a claim for a full formal apology, which is different from the statements of regret or deep sorrow that we keep hearing about. A true apology has 3 dimensions. You accept responsibility, you commit to repair, and you commit to non-repetition. And the plan follows with an Indigenous Peoples Development Program, repatriation for those who desire it, the establishment of cultural institutions in the region, addressing the public health crisis, and you can see literacy eradication right down to technology transfer. Now, technology transfer can be located within the Right to Development framework of the United Nations. The right to development focus is not only captured in the work of the UN and the works of Eric Williams and other scholars like Beckford and Lewis, who established for us the roots of Caribbean underdevelopment, but also in the artistic expressions of our singers. In this verse from Slave Driver, the Honorable Robert Nesta Bob Marley wailed, "Every time I hear the crack of the whip, my blood runs cold. I remember on the slave ship how they brutalized the very souls. Today they say that we are free, only to be chained in poverty. Slave driver, the table is turned." Marley's song not only reflects the memories of ancestral suffering via the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans, but the lines, "Today they say we are free, only to be chained in poverty," could very well have been commissioned by the CARICOM Reparations Commission. The program of activities of the Decade for People of African Descent, grounded in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, emphasizes the need for apology, repair, and reconciliation as a way of closing the dark chapters in our history. And finally, the Caribbean Reparation Justice Program includes debt cancellation and monetary compensation on the basis that the Caribbean governments that emerged from slavery and colonialism have inherited the massive crisis of community poverty and institutional unpreparedness for development. The pressure of development has too long driven governments to carry the burden of public employment and social policies designed to confront colonial legacies. The post-independence demand for development with input from former colonial powers still continues, especially as nationalist leaders anxious to capitalize on what Bruce Seeley calls the prostrate condition of European, the prostrate conditions of European nations after World War II, never pressed for compensation. Now, let me hasten to say that the rightness of the reparation struggle is not self-evident to all. And even if the right to reparation is recognized by international law, it doesn't mean that everyone is coming on board. So, there is support, there is opposition. Those who oppose raise these usual arguments. Too long ago in the past, there are no victims, they're all dead. Don't know who are we sitting here. Descendants cannot claim on behalf of their ancestors. The majority of Caribbean people are not in favor of the movement. That might be true. Caribbean people are opposed to repatriation. It was Africans who sold our ancestors. Go to them, not to Europe. It's too complicated a matter to work out. Governments can't pay. And the horrors of slavery cannot be used to justify reparation for individuals of African descent residing in the Caribbean. But every idea or movement faces its opposition, no matter how unfounded the arguments or how right the cause. Williams faced his own critics, as we know, with a few dismissing his arguments with venomous assaults, according to Selwyn Carrington, rather than with reasoned arguments, careful research, and analysis. The begging bowl mendicancy argument is rife among Caribbean people, reminding me of D.A. Farney's criticism of Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, which you can find in the new introduction to the revised edition by Colin Palmer, which he said presented the author's own community with the sustaining myth that capitalism was responsible for their condition, a view that has not found favor with Western Europe. That's his view. Western Europe's views in the contemporary period are well known, based on the public statements we have seen and heard, especially since 2004, when President Aristide of Haiti made a call on France, and since 2007, when during the bicentenary of the passing of the British Act to end the trafficking in enslaved Africans, reparation from Britain was placed in the spotlight. I think Britain is still wondering how they got away in 2007. While their universities, Bristol, London, Cambridge, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Oxford, etc., are busy studying their role in slavery, with Glasgow actually stepping forward with a £20 million reparation package, states have remained unmoved. And I just got a note from Jesus College at the University of Cambridge, which has a different project from the larger university, that it is looking also into its connection and asking me to be the external member on their working group. And of course I said yes. The movement in the USA has also intensified, and you may have seen that Georgetown, Princeton, Harvard, and others are making gestures of apology and repair. The Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda is ensuring that Harvard does not get to decide by itself what should be the level of repair, and has called them out to invest in his country, based on firm evidence that the enslaver, Isaac Royal, who started Harvard Law School, made money in Antigua. But the stance of the UK has mirrored that expressed by former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair in 2007. As you can see, he expressed deep sorrow, but that was about it. And this is more familiar to most people. And this answer was repeated. He said it in 2015, and as you heard this morning, it was only in 2015 that the loan that paid the part of the compensation money was repaid by those who rinsed it. But this statement was also in the letter that his response to CARICOM heads. It's repeated, those sentiments, by Lord Tariq Ahmad, British Minister of State with responsibility for the Caribbean, Commonwealth, and the United Nations. And yes, according to him, same kinds of sentiments. It would be better for Jamaica to look ahead and to maximize its potential through robust trade rather than to peer into its history. This from a country that won't stop peering into their history. Every single time you go to England, there's some other historical thing happening. Or some monument that you see, everybody's peering, but we mustn't peer. Well, we will peer if we want to peer. And then, as all high commissioners who come to Jamaica from the UK do, they give interviews boldly. And the latest one, High Commissioner Asif Ahmad, who says reparation for slavery is not a priority item for Britain at this time. And he actually told me when I spoke with him that it's not on the political agenda at all of the United Kingdom. He says, while the issue has been raised over the years by advocates, it has not been placed on the government's political agenda. I see that the leader of the Labour Party is disagreeing, but there are people who say people can say anything when they're in opposition. The test is if he comes to power, and with Brexit in the air, there are people who are hopeful, actually. But Corbyn is not alone in telling those who are saying we must move on and forget it, that not so fast. I was struck by these cartoons because this is the first time that I've seen in the Jamaican newspapers, the cartoon is actually taking on the issue of reparation. So to me, it's a great thing. So here's the British hiding behind this Zong monument. Modest monument established in St. Elizabeth in Black River because of this tragedy. December 22nd will be another anniversary of when the ship put in at Black River in Jamaica, and they had thrown 132 live people overboard to save a voyage and to claim insurance. But Massa Day not done, and the pro-colonialists are seeking to destabilize the reparation movement. So the road has become harder. In Eric Williams' formulation, Massa stood for colonialism, and even with the post-colonial social revolution that should have made Massa irrelevant, the Massa mentality of pro-colonialism is hanging around. As evidence, you can scan the regional newspapers to see how some of the descendants of enslaved Africans are reacting to the reparation discussion. Bigging up Massa, even though Williams told us, and I quote, that Massa developed the necessary philosophical rationalization of our relationship with him, which is that the workers, both African and Indian, were inferior beings, unfit for self-government, unequal to their superior masters, permanently destined to a status of perpetual subordination, unable ever to achieve equality. whether in occupation, skin color, legal systems, or economic systems. This one is from Howard Rennie. Caribbean nationals are not entitled to and will never get reparation for slavery because from ancient times until it was abolished in the 19th century, slavery was regarded as a natural institution, and he goes on. And then Michael Dingwall, he wrote a personal letter to, well, it's an open letter to the British Prime Minister in 2015. So, Mr. Prime Minister, there is currently a well-organized effort in the Caribbean to get your country to pay us black descendants of African slaves in the region reparations for slavery. While some of our intellectuals think that the reasons are sound, I, a proud black man, think that the reasons are not only baseless, but also insulting, leading former Prime Minister P.J. Patterson to say this, that it's not confined to the past and it is just. And if you follow the Gleaner and the Observer in Jamaica, you may even have seen some letters written by Lipton Matthews. The latest one attacked the University of the West Indies. He said, we're an intellectual ghetto. Instead of trying to solve the problems of the Caribbean, we're up at UWI talking about making patois equal to the English language, dancehall, and reparation. We don't have nothing better to do. And I'm sure similar ones must appear in your newspapers here. And I'll be happy to get some of them if you send them to me to add to my collection. Although, when I think about it, I hope you don't have too many down here, because when I compare the public education tradition led by academics and politicians in the region, I think that the people of Trinidad and Tobago had the best preparation, maybe only topped by Haiti and Cuba, with Jamaica following behind you. Your Prime Minister wrote and taught you to be nationalistic, but also anti-colonial. And he laid the foundations for you to understand why the enslaving power required even more conquest. In 1960, he told you that there were only two alternatives available to you: forward to independence or backward to colonialism, and we seem to be sliding back to colonialism. You not only became independent, you went on to become a republic because you wanted to be sure that Massa Day really done. But even Williams later admitted that political independence set the stage for but does not guarantee economic independence. So you have to take the baton a little further than he did and use reparation as an indispensable part of the search for economic independence. And to get there, we need Caribbean unity, which is a still unrealized ideal. But it also needs all of the historians on board, including those here who I know are working hard, but all of us need to work even harder to gather the evidence that we're going to need when we confront Europeans. As Williams told historians, and I quote, "If they do not learn something from history, their activities would then be cultural decoration or pleasant pastime, equally useless in these troubled times." And we are in troubled times. So as I wrap, why does the movement for reparatory justice still occupy the energies of so many people, especially within the culture of disunity and the prevalence of vocal anti-reparationists? Can we really destabilize white supremacy, which many see as the obstacle to reparatory justice? Is historian Nell Painter right when she asserts that the racial idea of blackness would likely always be with us, meaning also that white supremacy will always be with us? How do we treat the idea that, as Ta-Nehisi Coates observes, while the black political tradition is essentially hopeful, history shows us too many examples of heroic people whose struggles were not successful in their own time or at all. On the contrary, to the extent that they were successful, black politics was a necessary precondition, but never enough to foment change. Coates admits that not even emancipation should be viewed as a triumph of black activism or the moral force of the actions of the just over the unjust? Well, Williams would agree with him. He holds that it became impossible, for instance, to think about emancipation without the threat presented by disunion, to talk about the civil rights movement without the ghost of Nazism or the Cold War. It began to seem to me that black politics was the wind at the American window. At rare moments, the window opened and black people pushed through. The window seemed to open for one reason and one reason alone, some threat to white interest becoming intolerable. In this formulation, it is not enough to be hopeful that good will triumph over evil, because, he says, hope might be an overrated force in human history, unlike fear. So what will be the wind at the Caribbean window that will open up, create fear among former colonizers to enable the cause of reparatory justice to push through, especially in the face of the tenacity of white supremacy and the tenacity of injustice and the mass of non-support? I do not have all the answer, and all I know is that, ahistorical as it may seem to some people, I've heard that, we in the reparation movement have decided that we won't live in hopelessness, but to push on. If only in memory of our ancestors. And we can't but pause to pay tribute to these ancestors. These were women in Sam Sharp's army, as I call them, who suffered for their activism in the cause of Caribbean freedom. With the recent reparatory justice moves among institutions, though, it is clear, as Nelson Mandela once said when apartheid was toppled, quote, "It always looks impossible until it happened. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes," which is why, using the direction left by Capitalism and Slavery, the CRC is drafting another round of letters, now to more states, setting out their exact involvement in and benefits from African enslavement. All I can say as I end is thank you, Eric Williams, for leaving us your inspirational writings that contain the proof that may take us to Zion. Continue to rest in power. Thank you.